It was one of those mornings that started like every other. The alarm buzzed, the same dull tone echoing through the small apartment. David groaned, rolled over, and hit snooze, wishing he could steal a few more minutes of sleep. But he couldn't. Work started at 8 and the bus wouldn't wait for him. He dragged himself out of bed, washed his face, and stared at his reflection in the mirror. The man looking back at him seemed tired, not just from lack of sleep, but from the weight of routine. Every day felt the same. Wake up, go to work, come home, repeat. He made himself a cup of instant coffee, staring blankly out the window. The sky was pale gray, and the city was already alive with honking cars and people rushing to wherever they needed to be. It was the kind of morning that didn't feel special, just another day in a long line of days that blended together. David threw on his jacket and left his apartment. He walked quickly to the bus stop, adjusting his bag on his shoulder. On his way, he passed by the same small cafe he always did. The smell of fresh coffee drifted out, and it reminded him how much better their coffee was than the bitter instant one he made at home. He decided he had time for a quick stop. As he walked toward the cafe door, he noticed a man sitting on the sidewalk beside it. The man looked older, maybe in his late 60s, with a worn coat and a gray beard. He held a small piece of cardboard with shaky letters that read, "Need some change for food." His hands were rough, his eyes tired, but there was a quiet dignity about him. People passed him without a glance, stepping around him as if he didn't exist. David hesitated. He didn't usually stop for people like that. It wasn't because he didn't care, he just never knew what to do. He had told himself many times that life was hard for everyone, and maybe it wasn't his job to fix other people's problems. But that morning something made him stop. Maybe it was the man's calm face, or maybe it was the way the sign was written. Not begging, just stating the truth. David reached into his pocket and found a few coins. It wasn't much, but he dropped them into the man's small cup. The coins made a soft clinking sound, and the man looked up. His eyes met David's, and for a brief second something passed between them. Something human and simple. "Thank you, son," the man said, his voice gentle but steady. Sometimes small change brings big change. David didn't know what to say. He nodded awkwardly and went inside the cafe. While waiting for his coffee, those words echoed in his mind. Small change brings big change. He didn't really understand what the man meant, but the way he said it made it sound important. When he got his coffee, David sat near the window. Through the glass, he could see the man outside. People still walked past him, pretending not to see. Some glanced for a second and then quickly turned away. David watched as the man smiled faintly to a little boy who had pointed at him curiously before his mother pulled him along. The man didn't look angry or sad, just calm, as if he had accepted the world for what it was. David finished his drink and left for the bus. As he walked by again, he nodded to the man, who smiled back, his eyes kind. That smile stayed in David's mind for the rest of the day. At work, David sat at his desk staring at his computer screen, but his thoughts kept drifting. The numbers on the spreadsheet didn't hold his attention. He kept thinking about the man's words. Maybe it was just a simple saying, but it felt like more. He started wondering about the man's story. Who was he? What had happened to him? Did anyone care about him? David didn't know why, but those questions bothered him more than usual. When lunchtime came, David didn't go to the cafeteria with his coworkers. He walked outside and found a quiet bench nearby. He ate his sandwich slowly, still thinking about that old man outside the cafe. He remembered the roughness in his voice and the calm look in his eyes. There was something peaceful about him, something that made David feel small for complaining about his own life. He had a job, a home, food on his table, yet he still felt empty inside. Meanwhile, that man, with nothing but a cardboard sign and a few coins, had smiled as if he knew something David didn't. That night, David went home feeling uneasy. He turned on the TV, but the noise didn't help. He tried scrolling through his phone, but everything felt meaningless. He thought about the man again. What did he do when night came? Where did he sleep? Was he safe? The city could be harsh, especially after dark. David imagined the man sitting under some bridge or huddled in a doorway, trying to keep warm. The thought made him uncomfortable. The next morning, when David walked past the cafe again, the man was still there, sitting in the same spot, holding the same sign. This time, David didn't look away. He gave him a polite nod, and the man nodded back with a small smile. That simple exchange warmed something inside him. It wasn't pity, it was connection. Throughout the week, David saw him again and again. Sometimes he gave a few coins, sometimes just a smile. He didn't know why, but seeing that man had become part of his morning routine. It made his day feel a little less empty, as if he was part of something bigger, something more human. One rainy morning, David forgot his umbrella and had to run to the cafe for cover. The man was still there, sitting under a torn piece of plastic trying to stay dry. His coat was soaked and his hands trembled slightly from the cold. David's heart ached as he watched him. "Hey," David said, walking up to him. "Let me get you something warm." The man looked up, surprised but grateful. David went inside, bought a hot coffee and a sandwich, and handed them over. The man smiled, his hands shaking slightly as he took the food. "You didn't have to do that," he said softly. "I know," David replied. "But I wanted to." The man nodded. "Thank you, truly. Most people don't even see me." David hesitated for a second before asking, "What's your name?" The man smiled faintly. "Harold," he said. "And you?" "David." "Nice to meet you, David," Harold said, sipping the hot coffee slowly, savoring it like it was the best drink in the world. "You've got a kind heart. Don't lose that." David didn't know what to say. He just smiled awkwardly and said, "Take care, Harold. I'll see you around." As David walked away that morning, he felt something different. For the first time in a long time, his chest felt lighter. It wasn't about the coffee or the coins, it was about being seen and seeing someone else. About remembering that behind every tired face, there was a story. That night, as he lay in bed, David thought again about what Harold had said that first morning. Sometimes small change brings big change. He didn't fully understand it yet, but he could feel it. Something inside him had shifted just a little. He didn't know it then, but this simple act of kindness was about to change his life in ways he could never have imagined. A week had passed since David first stopped to talk with Harold. Life had gone on the same as always. Work, commute, tired evenings. But something inside him had changed. Every morning when he walked past the cafe, he looked for Harold. Some days he was there, sitting in his usual spot with the same small cardboard sign and that calm smile. Other days the spot was empty, and David found himself strangely disappointed. One bright Thursday morning, David spotted him again, this time sitting outside a grocery store a few blocks from the cafe. He looked thinner, and the sunlight made the lines on his face seem deeper. Still, when David approached, Harold smiled as if he had been expecting him. "You again," Harold said with a grin. "I was wondering when I'd see that friendly face." David laughed. "Guess I'm predictable." "Nothing wrong with that," Harold replied. "Predictable is safe. Safe means you survive another day." David thought about that as he looked at the few coins in Harold's small cup. He knew coins wouldn't change much for him. Instead, David walked into the grocery store and came back with a sandwich, a bottle of water, and a banana. He handed the bag over, and Harold's eyes softened with gratitude. "You didn't have to do all that," Harold said quietly. "I wanted to," David replied. "Figured you could use a proper lunch." Harold smiled, unwrapping the sandwich carefully as though it were something precious. "You know," he said between bites, "a man can go hungry for food, but going hungry for kindness, that's worse." David sat down beside him on the curb. "That's a good way to put it." They sat together for a while, talking about simple things: the weather, the city, how the world seemed to move faster every year. Harold spoke slowly, thoughtfully, like someone who had lived long enough to see things for what they really were. David listened. He found comfort in the old man's voice, a calm rhythm that made the noise of the street fade into the background. After a pause, David asked, "How did you end up here? I mean, if you don't mind me asking." Harold didn't seem offended. He looked out at the street for a long time before answering. "Life doesn't always turn the way you expect," he said. "I used to be a carpenter. Worked for almost 30 years. Had my own shop. Built furniture for a living. I was proud of my work. But things changed." He took a sip of water and continued. "My wife passed away about 10 years ago. After that, I lost focus. Spent money I shouldn't have. Made bad choices. Then came health issues, bills piling up. You fall behind a little, then a little more, and before you know it, the world forgets you exist." David sat quietly, listening. There was no bitterness in Harold's tone, only acceptance. "That must have been hard," he said softly. "It was," Harold admitted. But you can't live your life angry. I've seen men get angry at the world until they lose themselves completely. I decided I'd rather be poor and peaceful than bitter and broken. Those words hit David deeper than he expected. He realized how much anger he had been carrying himself. Anger at his boring job, at his lack of progress, at how meaningless everything felt. But Harold, with nothing to his name, seemed freer than he was. "Do you ever think about starting over?" David asked. Harold smiled faintly. "Every day. But starting over doesn't always mean going back. Sometimes it just means finding peace with where you are." David nodded slowly. He hadn't expected wisdom from a man sitting on the street, but Harold spoke with a clarity that few people had. They talked for another half hour before David had to leave for work. As he stood up, Harold said, "Thank you for the food, and for listening. Most people don't do that anymore." David smiled. "You're welcome. I'll see you around." That evening, as David rode the bus home, he couldn't stop thinking about their conversation. Harold's calm voice echoed in his mind, especially the part about peace. It made David realize how restless he had been. He always chased something, money, promotion, recognition, but it never felt enough. Harold, who had lost everything, seemed more grounded than anyone he knew. When he got home, David sat at his kitchen table staring at the same coffee cup he used every morning. He thought about his job and how little joy it brought him. He thought about the people at work who talked endlessly about deadlines and bonuses. None of it felt important anymore. He wanted something more, something that made him feel connected again. The next few days, David visited Harold whenever he could. Each time they talked about life. Harold shared stories from his younger years. How he built his first chair by hand, how he used to whistle while he worked, how his wife would bring him tea in the afternoons. There was warmth in his voice when he spoke about her. Even after all those years, it was clear he still loved her deeply. One afternoon, as they sat on a bench near the grocery store, Harold said something that stayed with David. "People think giving means losing something, but sometimes when you give, you're actually filling a space inside yourself you didn't even know was empty." David looked at him curiously. "You really think so?" Harold nodded. "You gave me a meal, sure, but you also gave me something to look forward to. Someone to talk to. You reminded me I still exist." That night, David couldn't sleep. He kept turning over Harold's words in his head. Maybe he hadn't just helped Harold. Maybe Harold was helping him too in ways he didn't yet understand. A few days later, when David stopped by again, Harold handed him a small folded piece of paper. "Here," he said, "I wrote something for you. You don't have to read it now. Just keep it." David tucked the paper into his pocket. Later that night, after dinner, he remembered it and opened it. The handwriting was shaky but clear. It read, "It's not what you have, but what you give, that makes your story worth telling." David stared at the words for a long time. They were simple, yet they carried so much weight. He felt something stir inside him, a quiet understanding. He looked around his small apartment, filled with things he didn't really need, and realized how empty it all was compared to the feeling of that one small act of kindness. Over the next week, David found himself smiling more often. He greeted people in the elevator, helped a coworker with a task, and even called his mother just to ask how she was doing. Little things, small changes, but they made him feel alive again. Every time he saw Harold, they talked like old friends. They shared stories, jokes, and sometimes silence that didn't feel awkward. David began to see the world differently. The city, which once seemed cold and busy, now felt full of people with stories like Harold's, some visible, some hidden. One evening, as the sun set and the streets turned golden, David said goodbye to Harold and walked toward the bus stop. He felt peaceful, something he hadn't felt in years. For the first time, he didn't dread the next day. He didn't feel trapped in routine. Instead, he felt grateful for the conversations, for the lessons, for the reminder that life was about connection, not just survival. As he sat on the bus ride home, he took the note out again, reading it one more time. The words looked the same, but they meant something deeper now. He slipped it into his wallet, deciding he would carry it wherever he went. That night, before sleeping, David wrote in his old notebook something he hadn't done in years. Just one sentence. "Kindness is the only thing that grows when you give it away." He didn't know it yet, But this small spark would soon grow into something much bigger, something that would not only change Harold's life, but his own forever. Over the next several weeks, David's routine began to change without him even noticing. His mornings no longer felt rushed or dull. He would wake up, make his usual cup of coffee, and feel a quiet sense of purpose. On his way to work, he always stopped by the grocery store or the cafe to see if Harold was there. Most days he was, and every time David saw him, it felt like seeing an old friend. Their conversations had grown longer. They talked about everything: life, work, the world, and even the small things most people never thought about. Harold had a way of turning ordinary topics into something meaningful. He didn't talk much about money or success. Instead, he spoke about gratitude, patience, and finding peace even when life felt heavy. One morning, as David handed him a cup of coffee, Harold smiled and said, "You know, every sunrise is like a second chance. You can't undo yesterday, but you can choose what kind of person you want to be today." David chuckled. "That's a poetic way to look at it." Harold shrugged. "It's the only way to survive. If you stop believing in new days, you stop living." Those words lingered in David's mind the whole day. He couldn't explain it, but Harold's calm wisdom made him think deeply about his own life. For years, he had been living on autopilot, working for a paycheck, chasing promotions, thinking that happiness would come someday. But now, he started to realize that happiness might already be here, hiding in small, ordinary moments. One Friday afternoon, David stayed late at work. His co-workers had already left, and the office felt strangely quiet. As he packed up his things, he thought about how empty the place felt. Rows of desks, computers, paperwork, it was all so cold. He imagined Harold sitting outside in the cold night, yet somehow more alive than anyone in this building. That thought made David pause. He realized that maybe comfort and peace weren't the same thing. That weekend, David decided to do something different. He invited Harold to join him for lunch at a nearby park. Harold was surprised but happy to accept. When they sat together under a tree, Harold took a deep breath, looking around at the people walking dogs and children playing. "It's been a long time since I sat somewhere like this," he said quietly. "Used to come to the park every Sunday with my wife. She loved watching the ducks." David smiled. "You must miss her a lot." Harold nodded, his eyes soft. "Every day. But I'm grateful I had her at all. Some people live their whole lives and never get to love someone like that." David didn't say anything for a while. He could feel the honesty in Harold's words. It wasn't sadness, it was acceptance. That kind of peace felt rare. He wondered how someone who had lost so much could still speak with such grace. After lunch, they sat watching the clouds drift across the sky. Harold turned to him and said, "Can I tell you something, David? You remind me of how I used to be when I was younger. I kept thinking life would start after I got this or achieved that. But life doesn't wait for you to be ready. It's happening right now." David looked down at his hands. "I guess I've been waiting a long time then." Harold smiled gently. "Then maybe it's time to stop waiting." That night when David got home, he opened his old notebook again. He hadn't written much since he was younger, but the words came naturally now. He wrote about his talks with Harold, about the lessons hidden in small moments. Writing made him feel alive again, like he was rediscovering a part of himself he'd forgotten. A few days later, when David met Harold, he told him about his writing. Harold's face lit up. "That's wonderful," he said. "When you write, you leave pieces of your heart behind. Someday someone will read those words and feel a little less alone." Then Harold reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small folded paper. "Here," he said, "you'll need this someday." David unfolded it later that evening. Inside, written in Harold's shaky handwriting, were the words, "It's not what you have but what you give that makes your story worth telling." David smiled. He had already seen the same sentence before, written in the note Harold gave him weeks ago. But seeing it again felt different this time, like Harold wanted to make sure he didn't forget it. In the days that followed, David began making changes, small at first. He stopped rushing through his mornings. He started greeting people more warmly, paying attention to the things he used to overlook: the way sunlight hit the buildings, the smell of fresh bread near the cafe, the laughter of children walking to school. Life started to feel fuller. One afternoon, David stayed longer with Harold. The weather was mild, and they sat outside the store as people walked by. A man dropped a few coins into Harold's cup without saying a word. Harold smiled after him and said quietly, "It's funny how people think charity is about money. It's not about what you give, it's about how you give it." David nodded. "I think I get that now." Harold looked at him. "Do you?" David thought for a moment. "Maybe not completely, but I'm learning." Harold laughed softly. "That's all anyone can do." That evening, David couldn't stop thinking about that conversation. He looked around his apartment again, noticing how quiet it always felt. He had everything, furniture, a TV, food, but it all felt empty. He realized that all the things he had spent years collecting didn't really fill the space inside him. It was connection, kindness, and purpose that did. Later that week, while walking home from work, David passed by a young man sitting on the sidewalk, holding a cardboard sign. For a moment he hesitated. Then he stopped, crouched down, and handed the man a sandwich from his bag. "Here," he said, "it's not much, but I hope it helps." The young man looked up, surprised. "Thanks, man," he said softly. "No one said a word to me all day." David smiled and walked away, feeling something warm spread in his chest. It wasn't pride or pity, it was connection. The same feeling Harold had given him. That night, David told Harold about it. Harold smiled like a proud teacher. "That's it," he said. "That's how it spreads, one act at a time. That's what I meant by small change bringing big change." As the sun set behind the buildings, they sat together in silence. The sky was painted in shades of gold and orange, and the world seemed peaceful for a moment. David realized that life wasn't about fixing everything. It was about doing what you could, where you were with what you had. Before leaving that evening, Harold looked at him and said quietly, "You've got a good heart. David, don't let the world harden it. People will disappoint you, but don't stop giving. Giving is what keeps you human." David smiled, his throat tight with emotion. "I won't." That night he couldn't sleep. He thought about Harold's life, about how easily one bad turn could push someone off the edge, and how strength wasn't always about money or success. Sometimes it was about surviving with kindness intact. He realized then that Harold wasn't just someone he helped, he was his teacher. Someone who had come into his life at the exact time he needed direction. And though David didn't know what the future would bring, he knew one thing for sure. He wanted to live differently. To help, to listen, to give, not because he had to, but because it made life worth living. As he closed his notebook that night, he wrote one last line before turning off the light. "Maybe we don't change the world by doing big things. Maybe we change it by doing small things with a big heart." He didn't know it yet, but those words would guide every step he took from that day on. The next few weeks passed peacefully, and seeing Harold had become one of the most meaningful parts of David's life. Every conversation left him thinking. Every smile made him feel grounded. It was as if the old man had slowly become a mirror showing David what really mattered. Work still took up most of his day, but it no longer felt as heavy. He was kinder to people, more patient, and even his co-workers noticed the difference. One chilly morning, David walked his usual route to the cafe with 2 cups of coffee, one for himself and one for Harold. He smiled when he saw the empty spot near the grocery store, thinking maybe Harold was running late. But as the minutes passed, no one showed up. He waited a bit longer, feeling a strange sense of worry. Harold had never missed a day before. He decided to walk around the block, hoping to find him sitting somewhere else, but he wasn't there either. The city was waking up, the smell of fresh bread from the bakery, cars honking, people rushing. But something about that morning felt off. David stood there, holding the extra cup of coffee until it went cold. For the first time in weeks, he felt alone again. The next day, Harold was still gone. Then another day passed and another. David asked around the nearby shops if anyone had seen the old man, but most people shook their heads. One woman who worked at the cafe said, "I think he was here a few days ago, but I haven't seen him since. Maybe he moved somewhere warmer." David tried to convince himself that was true, but deep down he felt uneasy. Every morning he checked the same spot, hoping to see that familiar face, the calm smile, the cardboard sign, but it stayed empty. The world had gone back to walking past that corner without noticing what was missing. One evening, David sat alone at his apartment, staring at the small wooden coin Harold had given him weeks ago. The one with the word change carved into it. He turned it over in his hand, remembering Harold's laugh and his gentle advice. It felt strange how someone who had so little could leave such a big space behind. Days turned into weeks, and David still hadn't found him. Life continued, but it wasn't the same. Every morning felt incomplete, like he had lost a friend he never got to say goodbye to. He tried to focus on work, but his thoughts kept drifting. He even began walking different routes, hoping maybe Harold had moved somewhere nearby. But no matter where he looked, the old man was nowhere to be found. Then one afternoon, as David walked past the cafe, he noticed something strange. There was a small white envelope taped to the inside of the cafe window, near where Harold used to sit. Written on the front in shaky handwriting was his name, David. His heart jumped. He carefully peeled the envelope off the glass and stepped aside to open it. Inside was a folded note and something small and wooden. His hands trembled as he unfolded the paper. "Dear David," it began, "by the time you read this, I'll be gone from this corner. A volunteer from a nearby shelter helped me find a place to stay. They're giving me a chance to start over, and I'm grateful for that. But before I left, I wanted to thank you. You may think you just gave me coffee, food, or your time, but you gave me something I'd lost long ago. Hope. You reminded me that there are still kind people in this world, and that life can still change for the better, no matter how late it feels. Keep being kind. Don't stop giving, not money but heart. That's the kind of change that matters most. Your friend, Harold." At the bottom of the note, David found the same small wooden coin he had given back to Harold weeks earlier. On one side, it still said change. On the other, Harold had carved new words. Keep going. David stood there for a long time, reading the letter again and again. His chest ached, but it wasn't sadness, it was something deeper, something warm. He realized that Harold hadn't disappeared. He had simply moved forward, the same way he'd always encouraged David to do. That night, David placed the wooden coin and the letter on his desk. He couldn't stop staring at them. He thought about how their friendship had started with something as small as a few coins and a smile, and how it had grown into something life-changing. The following morning, David woke up early. He took the letter out again, read it one more time, and slipped it into his wallet. On his way to work, he stopped by the same cafe, bought 2 coffees, one for himself and one he left on the windowsill outside. It was his quiet way of saying goodbye. But as the days passed, the emptiness Harold had left behind began to push David toward something new. He started volunteering on weekends at the same shelter Harold mentioned in the letter. The first time he walked in, he was nervous, unsure what to expect. But the people there welcomed him warmly. Some were staff, some were struggling, and some were just there to talk. One evening, a young woman came in with a baby in her arms. She looked tired and scared. David sat with her, listened as she talked about losing her job and not having a place to stay. He didn't have the answers, but he listened, the same way Harold had once listened to him. When she smiled through tears and said, "Thank you for listening," David felt something shift inside. He realized then that this was the real meaning of what Harold had taught him. Kindness wasn't about fixing someone's life. It was about reminding them they weren't invisible. It was about being human together. As weeks went by, David found himself spending more time at the shelter. He helped with meals, talked with people, and shared small moments that reminded him of Harold. He didn't tell anyone the full story about the old man who had changed his life. But sometimes when someone would ask what brought him there, he would smile and say, "A friend taught me what real change means." One cold evening, after finishing his volunteer shift, David walked home through the quiet streets. The air was crisp and the city lights reflected off the wet pavement. He thought about how much had changed in just a few months. He was still the same man, living in the same apartment, working the same job, but his heart felt different, lighter, fuller. When he reached home, he placed the wooden coin back on his desk and whispered softly, "Thank you, Harold." A few months later, he received a message from one of the shelter coordinators. Harold had indeed stayed there for a while, they said. He was doing better, healthier, and helping out whenever he could. He had even started carving again, small wooden tokens that he gave to other residents as reminders to keep going. Reading that message made David smile through tears. It felt like everything had come full circle. The man he once helped had gone on to help others, passing forward the same kindness that had connected them. That night, David walked to the same corner where he had first met Harold. The spot was empty, but it didn't feel lonely anymore. He placed a small flower near the wall, not out of sadness, but gratitude. The world had one less man sitting alone, and that meant more than anything. As he turned to leave, he looked up at the sky. It was filled with stars, faint but steady. He thought of Harold's words. Every sunrise is a second chance. Maybe this was what change really looked like. Not something loud or grand, but quiet, steady, and deeply human. David smiled to himself, tucked his hands into his pockets, and walked home, feeling like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Months had passed since the day David last heard about Harold. Life had slowly fallen into a calm rhythm again, but something inside him had changed forever. He was no longer rushing through his days the way he used to. Each morning began with quiet reflection, and every evening ended with gratitude. He didn't know exactly what he was grateful for. Maybe for the small things, maybe for the lessons Harold had left behind. But it made his days feel fuller. He kept volunteering at the shelter on weekends. What started as a simple way to honor Harold's memory had become something deeply personal. He knew the people who came there by name now. The young man who was trying to get back to school. The older woman who had just found a job. The father who never stopped smiling despite his struggles. Every story reminded David that kindness could plant roots in the most unexpected places. One evening, while serving dinner, one of the coordinators came over to him with a big smile. "David," she said, "we got a letter today from someone who wanted to thank the volunteers. It's from Harold." For a moment, David froze. The sound of Harold's name hit him like a rush of warm air in the cold. He quickly wiped his hands on a towel and asked, "Can I read it?" The coordinator handed him the envelope. The handwriting was the same, shaky but full of life. He stepped outside to read it under the dim streetlight. "Dear friends," the letter began, "I'm writing from a small town where I've started a new chapter. Thanks to all of you, I found a place to call home again. I even have a small job at a workshop carving little keepsakes from wood. Every piece I make reminds me of people who gave me hope when I had none. To David, if you're still helping at the shelter, I want you to know you were the first person who saw me when I felt invisible. You reminded me that one act of kindness can change a life. Don't stop doing what you're doing. You've become that light for others now. Your friend, always, Harold." David smiled as he read the words, feeling tears form in his eyes. He could almost hear Harold's voice, steady, kind, and full of quiet wisdom. He folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket, his heart lighter than it had been in months. That night, as he walked home, he thought about how their paths had crossed by pure chance, and how that chance meeting had rippled outward into so many other lives. It amazed him how something so small could become something so big. The next morning, David went to a small craft store in town. He bought a few pieces of smooth wood, some carving tools, and sandpaper. He didn't really know what he was doing, but he wanted to try. He sat by his window and began carving slowly, his hands awkward at first. After a few attempts, he managed to carve a small circle, similar to the one Harold had made. On one side, he wrote "change," on the other, he wrote "pass it on." When he looked at it, he smiled. It wasn't perfect, rough around the edges, uneven, but it carried meaning. He decided to make more of them. Whenever he met someone who seemed down or lost, he quietly slipped one into their hand. He didn't explain too much. He just said, "Keep this. It might remind you of something good." Some people smiled, some cried, and some didn't understand right away. But that didn't matter. David wasn't doing it for recognition. He was doing it because Harold had shown him how powerful small acts could be. Over time, David's life began to shift in other ways too. He found himself more connected to people, more aware of moments that used to pass him by. He noticed the old man who swept the streets every morning, the woman who sold flowers at the corner, the kids playing soccer near the park. Everyone had a story. Everyone needed kindness. One day, while volunteering, a man named Luke came into the shelter. He looked tired, his clothes worn out, and his eyes carried the weight of something heavy. David offered him a meal and sat beside him. At first, the man didn't say much. But after a while, he began to talk about how he'd lost his home, his job, and how people had stopped seeing him. David listened quietly, nodding at times, letting him speak without interruption. When the man finished, David reached into his pocket and pulled out one of the wooden coins. He handed it to him and said softly, This helped me once. Maybe it'll help you too. The man turned the coin over in his hands, reading the words, "Pass it on." He looked up, confused but touched. "What does it mean?" he asked. David smiled. "It means change doesn't stop with us. When life gets better, you give it forward." The man nodded slowly, tears forming in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. That night, as David walked home, he felt something familiar in his chest. The same feeling he'd had when he first met Harold. A quiet warmth that told him he was on the right path. Weeks turned into months again. The shelter continued to grow, and David became one of its most trusted volunteers. He helped organize small events, fundraisers, and even art sessions where people could paint or carve. He always started those sessions with Harold's story. Not the sad parts, but the hopeful ones. The story of a man who had lost everything but still believed in kindness. One evening, during one of those art sessions, a little girl came up to David. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old. She held out a small wooden token she had made. On it, she had written 2 words in messy handwriting. "Keep going." David froze. Those were the exact words Harold had carved on the coin he once gave him. He looked at her, speechless for a moment. "Where did you learn that?" he asked gently. The girl smiled shyly. "My mom told me that's what you say when you care about someone." He smiled back, his heart tightening with emotion. It was as if Harold's spirit had found its way through time, through people, through every small act that had followed. The kindness had multiplied, spreading quietly from one person to another. Later that night, David sat alone by the window again, holding the coin Harold had carved and the one the little girl had made. He placed them side by side and whispered, "You were right, Harold. Change really does go on." He thought about all the people who had come through the shelter, the ones who had found homes, the ones still searching, and the ones who had found hope again. He thought about Harold starting fresh in a new town, carving wooden keepsakes, helping others like he once was helped. It all felt connected, like invisible threads tying people together through kindness. The next day, David returned to the same street corner where it all began. The place looked different now, cleaner, busier. But he could still picture that cold morning when he first saw Harold sitting there with his cardboard sign. He stood quietly for a while, remembering the old man's voice, his laugh, his calm way of speaking. Then he reached into his pocket, took out one of his wooden coins, and placed it gently near the spot where Harold used to sit. He whispered, "Thank you, my friend." As he walked away, a light breeze brushed against his face. He smiled, feeling that same warmth again. Maybe it was just the wind. Or maybe in some way Harold was still there, watching, smiling, proud. From that day forward, David never stopped making those wooden coins. He gave them out everywhere, to strangers, friends, children, and anyone who needed a reminder that kindness still existed. Each one carried 2 simple words, "Pass it on." And though life kept moving, the memory of that unlikely friendship stayed alive, echoing quietly in every heart it touched. In the end, Harold hadn't just changed David's life. He had started a chain of kindness that continued long after both of them had gone their separate ways. And that, David realized, was what real change looked like. Not something big or loud, but something human. Something that keeps going, one heart at a time.